So, what I have been tasked to do in this video is assess what I feel like is the most pressing threat to journalists in my time. And I don't entirely feel qualified to do that. I'm a digital media literacy student, not some sort of international relations expert. But what I can do as a digital media literacy student is talk about why I think digital media threats to journalists are so important and why they are, if not the most pressing threat, a pretty big threat, and why they are important to talk about. I think there's been a rise in two key things, and I think these things are related. One, there have been rises in basically digital attacks on journalists, whether that be through social media or through, as we'll see, sort of government support for these attacks. And two, an undermining of trust in journalists and traditional media. So, according to Reporters Without Borders, this is the source I'm going to be using for most of this, attacking journalists is basically a way to intimidate them or silence them, and this is something that our digital landscape has made a lot easier to do through social media. So what we're seeing is doxing and death threats, and even if these death threats, for instance, aren't necessarily going to lead to something actionable, even if nothing physical happens to a reporter based on an onslaught of threats that they're seeing on social media. What these death threats and physical harm threats do is they make it very intimidating and hostile and frankly exhausting psychologically to be a journalist. So this discourages journalists from speaking. And this is something that is happening to a lot of journalists. One Council of Europe survey found that about 40% of European journalists have found that they had experienced forms of harassment that had affected their personal lives. That's pretty big. And in addition, what these sort of mobs of either bots or individuals can do is sort of obstruct real debate by sort of skewing the public perception of a debate in one direction or another. You can't really find maybe what people are actually saying or thinking at large in an area or about an issue because there is a bot army talking about it in one direction. It basically obstructs the real debate. This is something that an investigative journalist named Alberto Escorcia calls techno-censorship. And what makes this kind of compounded for a lot of individual journalists is that often these are people who are working in places where, real, genuine reporting is very important, like authoritarian regimes, or they're covering controversial political groups or corruption in the government. And this is particularly impactful for these places because what all of these attacks and obstructions do is they undermine public trust in journalism. And as trust in these traditional media sources goes down, trust in social media and what people are seeing on social media, which is oftentimes this obstruction, is going up. So we have a Pew Research Center study that has found that trust in traditional news media has been sharply declining in recent years. That people tend to trust the news they get through social media about as much as they trust the national news media, at least in America. And this is, I think, a consequence of these attacks, especially when you see, for example, large public figures playing into these attacks and questions of journalistic integrity online. For example, President Modi of India is a good example in that he has supported a lot of attacks on journalists in his country He even invited some of the controversial social media figures to events, for example, and this tends to show people in India that, like, oh, this is legitimate, when in reality it isn't. And I think that's a big threat to journalism, not only because of what it can do to public trust, but because it can happen to any journalist. It is widespread, and that's really the biggest issue.